There are over 10,000 named tomato varieties, and almost none of them ever reach a grocery store shelf. Not red ones. Not the ones that taste like a Starburst candy. Not the one that survived a war folded inside someone's coat pocket. Not even the one that vanished completely and came back from a single 87-year-old seed. Most people think a tomato is just a tomato. It isn't. None of this happened by accident. A wild tomato in South America used to be smaller than a marble, somewhere between then and now. It's split into thousands of different versions of itself. Different sizes, different colors, different chemistry. Tomatoes didn't do that on their own. People did one stubborn decision at a time. I used to think heirloom just meant old. It doesn't. An heirloom variety isn't an old tomato. It's a tomato a family or a community kept reseeding by hand year after year without a company controlling the cross. Lose one growing season and decades of that work can disappear with it. Land grant extension programs, the same offices behind your county fair and 4-H program, have documented exactly how easy that loss is. So when a variety survives 100 years, that's not luck. That's an unbroken chain of people who didn't drop it. Who? That's basically the whole story of the next one. There's a variety breeders call the traveler tomato, and the first time you see one, it looks wrong. It's deeply ribbed, almost pleated, like someone took a regular tomato and pinched the sides together while it was still soft. The legend that gets passed around is that pioneers carried these on long trips because the ribbed shape made them easier to slice evenly and pack flat in a wagon. Nice story. Probably more folklore than fact, and I'm not going to pretend it's confirmed history, because it isn't. What is confirmed is the mechanism behind that ribbed shape, and it's called fasciation. Plant science programs at universities like Oregon State have documented fasciation across all kinds of crops, not just tomatoes. It happens when the growing tip of the plant, instead of staying a single point, flattens out and fuses together extra plant tissue as it grows. Imagine a single lane road that suddenly widens into 4 lanes, merging back into one. That's roughly what's happening at the cellular level. And the fruit that grows from that flattened, fused tip comes out pleated instead of round. Here's the part that catches people off guard. Fasciation isn't rare because it's hard to cause. It's rare because most growers see a deformed-looking tomato and throw the seeds out. Somebody, generations back, looked at a ribbed, lumpy fruit and decided to save the seed anyway. Instead of tossing it, that one decision is the entire reason this variety still exists. Multiply that by every heirloom on this list, and the pattern starts to repeat itself a lot faster than you'd expect. That's a ribbed tomato shaped by an accident someone chose to keep. The next one wasn't shaped by an accident at all. It was shaped by a war and almost didn't survive it. Take one guess. How many decades families risked keeping a tomato seed they weren't supposed to have? The black Krim comes out of Crimea, the peninsula on the Black Sea that's changed hands more times than most countries have existed. The name itself traces back to Krim, an old regional name with disputed origins, possibly tied to a word for fortress or steep bank, depending on which historical source you trust. And honestly, the linguistics get murky enough that I'm not going to overstate certainty there. What's not murky is the timeline. This variety has been documented as growing in that region since at least the 1800s, through empire changes, through the Soviet era, through war. Surviving mostly because regular families kept saving and replanting the seed rather than any government program protecting it. The fruit itself is dark, almost a dusty brownish maroon, with green shoulders near the stem. That color comes from a compound called anthocyanin sitting close to the skin, the same family of pigment that colors red cabbage and the skins of red grapes. It's worth being precise here because plenty of tomato content gets this wrong. Black Krim isn't the only old purple-black heirloom carrying that pigment in the skin. Cherokee Purple, another variety with deep roots, was already doing something similar well before some of the newer lab-bred purple tomatoes showed up. Black Krim earns its reputation less from being chemically unique and more from intensity of flavor. Growers and extension trial programs consistently describe it as having a richer, almost smoky, less acidic taste than a standard red slicer. What actually matters here isn't the chemistry footnote. It's what the surviving seed represents. People were saving Black Krim seed through periods when saving the wrong thing, or being caught with the wrong supplies could get you in real trouble. A tomato seed doesn't usually carry that kind of weight. This one did for the families who kept it going. Anyway, biodiversity. It turns out doesn't usually survive because a government decided to protect it. It survives because ordinary people decided one particular plant was worth the risk of keeping. The traveler tomato survived because someone kept an accident. Black Krim survived because families refused to let it disappear. Neither of those is true of the next one. That's the garden peach. If you've never grown one, the name undersells it a little because it isn't just fuzzy like a peach. It actually has a soft, velvety skin you can feel from a few feet away. Underneath that fuzz is a small yellow to blush fruit with a mild, almost floral sweetness that's noticeably gentler than a standard tomato. The fuzz isn't decoration. It's a trait called trichomes, tiny hair-like structures on the surface of the leaf and fruit. And most tomato plants actually have some version of them, just usually too fine to notice. Garden peach has an unusually dense coat of them, likely inherited from older wild tomato relatives where those hairs help deter insects and slow water loss on the leaf surface. On the fruit itself, the trait mostly just survived because growers liked the novelty and the flavor enough to keep choosing it over smoother types, generation after generation. This is the kind of variety that doesn't have a dramatic survival story behind it. Nobody smuggled it through a war. It's just stuck around because people kept growing it for one simple reason. It tastes like somebody cared more about flavor than about how it looks stacked in a crate at a store. Have you noticed something building across these first four? A pleated tomato kept because someone refused to toss a strange-looking fruit. A near-extinct heirloom kept alive through war because families wouldn't let it go. A fuzzy, fragile little fruit kept around purely because people liked how it tasted. None of these exist because a lab engineered them on purpose. They exist because regular people made small, repeated, unglamorous decisions to keep something around. That's the real pattern under all of this. And it's about to flip because the next few tomatoes were built on purpose by people who spent actual decades chasing one specific outcome. There's a tomato breeder's name that comes up constantly with the green zebra, and that's Tom Wagner. Story goes that Wagner developed this variety as a teenager in the 1950s, crossing different striped and green flesh tomatoes, trying to land on a specific look and a specific tang. A green tomato that ripens with yellow-green striping and a bright, citrusy bite, sharp enough that some people genuinely don't like it. Would you have kept working on a single tomato variety for years before you even had a name for it? Wagner did off and on, refining it for roughly 2 decades before it stabilized into the variety we now call green zebra, which seed companies like Verpy and Johnny Selected Seeds eventually picked up and distributed widely. Here's the part that's easy to miss because the breeding story gets all the attention stabilizing. A tomato variety isn't one decision, it's hundreds of small ones, repeated every single season. You plant the seeds, you watch which plants actually express the traits you want, you save seed only from those, and you do it again next year. And the year after that, because a single good-looking fruit doesn't mean the trait will breed true, most people quit somewhere in year 3 or 4. Wagner didn't quit for roughly 20 years, and here's something a lot of people who've actually grown green zebra will tell you. including more than a few who left comments on tomato content exactly like this. Not everybody loves it. Some growers find it sharply sour, almost bitter, especially if it's picked even slightly underripe, since the ripeness window on a green when ripe tomato is genuinely harder to judge by eye than a red one. That's worth saying plainly. Instead of pretending every heirloom is universally delicious, part of the appeal of having 10,000 varieties is that they're not all built for the same palate. Great tomatoes don't usually start with someone trying to make something everyone will love. They start with one stubborn person trying to make something they personally find interesting. Even if it takes 20 years and even if some people end up hating it, that's 2 decades spent perfecting one specific outcome on purpose. The next breeder wasn't chasing a plan at all. He was chasing accidents on purpose. Which one would you rather be? Brad Gates runs a seed company out of California, and the variety that made him known well beyond it is Brad's Atomic Grape. If you haven't seen one, picture an elongated cherry tomato striped in purple, green, and red-brown, almost iridescent depending on the light, looking less like produce and more like something from a jewelry display. Gates didn't design that look from scratch. By his own account, the variety came out of years of growing huge numbers of seedlings from intentional crosses and then walking the rows looking for the plants that broke pattern. Fruit with stripes that shouldn't be there. Colors that didn't match either parent. Most growers call those, treat them as a failed cross. Gates went the other direction and kept replanting the weirdest looking offspring instead of the most normal ones. Season after season, until the trait stabilized into something he could reliably reproduce. Would you have thrown that plant away the first time you saw a streak of color that wasn't supposed to be there? Most growers would, and that's exactly why this kind of variety is rare. It's not that the genetic potential for striped, multicolor tomatoes is unusual. Plenty of crosses can throw odd color patterns. It's that almost nobody is patient enough or curious enough to keep chasing an accident across multiple growing seasons instead of just starting over with something predictable. Every striking variety on this list so far started with one person deciding an accident or an oddity was worth keeping rather than discarding. Most people assume rare just means hard to grow. Most people get that wrong. So here's one most people haven't heard because it never made it into a seed catalog. It almost didn't make it into existence at all. A variety known as Giant Crimson was, by most accounts, considered extinct until a single seed packet, roughly 87 years old, turned up one packet, not a backup, not a second source anywhere. The kind of find that should have been unviable. Since seed viability drops sharply over decades even under good storage conditions, a seed grower took on the job of trying to germinate what was left in that old packet, working through it seed by seed with no guarantee any of them would even sprout. From what's been documented around the rediscovery, only one seed from that packet actually germinated and survived to maturity. One out of an entire variety that had effectively vanished. The whole lineage came back from a single surviving plant, which then had to be carefully regrown and reseeded across several seasons before there was enough stock to call the variety recovered. Here's the part that's easy to skim past. That's not a metaphor about persistence. That's what actually happened. An entire named tomato variety with whatever specific flavor and growth habit made someone bother naming and saving it in the first place came within one failed germination of being gone permanently. No backup copy, no second packet sitting somewhere else. One seed worked, and because it worked, the variety exists, again, now sold in small seed lots to home growers who never have had the chance otherwise. This is the one on the list I keep coming back to, not because of how it tastes. Most descriptions just call it a large, productive crimson red slicer. Solid, not flashy. It stays with me because of how close thousands of tomato varieties came to being one fewer People were now bringing tomatoes back from the edge of extinction with a single seed. The next person wasn't trying to save anything. She was trying to put something into a tomato that, as far as anyone could tell, had never been there before. This one needs a careful word choice, because a couple of earlier tomato videos got this exact point wrong, and it's worth getting right. The Indigo Rose tomato, developed through a roughly 10-year breeding program at Oregon State University, was not the first tomato to ever have anthocyanin pigment in its fruit. Cherokee Purple and Black Crim, both far older heirlooms, already carried that same family of pigment in their skin. What Indigo Rose actually did, and this part is actually new, was push anthocyanin production deep into the flesh itself, not just the skin, by crossing in genes from wild tomato relatives that naturally carry much higher pigment levels. Then selecting offspring across roughly a decade of generations until that trait bred true and stable. The breeding team's goal wasn't decoration. Anthocyanin is the same antioxidant compound class found in blueberries, though it's worth being accurate there too. Since blueberry flesh itself is actually pale green on the inside, the deep blue color comes almost entirely from the skin. Researchers were specifically curious whether that compound could be concentrated inside a tomato's actual flesh instead of just its skin. Partly to study the plant genetics involved, and partly because of general interest in antioxidant-rich produce. It took roughly 10 years of crossing, growing out, and selecting before the trait was stable enough to release as a named variety. Would you have kept funding and running that program for a decade with no guarantee it would ever stabilize into something useful? That's a real question, because plant breeding programs get cut for less. 10 years is a long time to chase one trait with no commercial product at the other end of it until very late in the process. The deep purple coloring on an Indigo Rose only develops on the side of the fruit that's actually exposed to direct sunlight. The shaded side stays green-yellow even at full ripeness. So a single tomato can be half purple, half pale. Depending entirely on which way it was facing on the vine, that's not a flaw. It's the compound being produced in direct response to light exposure, almost like the fruit is sunburning itself a deep violet on purpose. 10 years of deliberate science to push a pigment somewhere it had never concentrated before in a fruit far younger than the war-surviving heirlooms, and rediscovered extinct varieties already on this list. So look back across everything so far. A rib tomato kept because of an accident nobody threw away. A war-surviving heirloom kept alive by ordinary families. A fuzzy fruit kept purely for flavor. A striped tomato perfected over 20 deliberate years. A jewel-tone variety built by chasing accidents on purpose. An entire variety brought back from one surviving seed, and a tomato deliberately engineered to carry a pigment deeper than it had ever gone before. None of these are really stories about tomatoes. They're stories about the specific kind of person who looks at something ordinary and decides it isn't finished yet. Humans didn't spend 2 centuries trying to build the one perfect tomato. If that were the goal, there'd be one variety left by now, not 10,000. What actually happened is people kept building the tomato that fit their specific moment, their specific need, their specific stubborn curiosity. A tomato sturdy enough to survive a war, a tomato strange enough to be worth saving from the compost pile, a tomato sweet enough to eat off the vine, a tomato scientific enough to study. Every extraordinary tomato on this list changed somebody. And somewhere along the way, every one of those somebodies changed a tomato right back. You probably won't remember every variety by name a week from now, and that's fine. That's not really the point. What's worth remembering is this: humans didn't just domesticate the tomato. They turned evolution into a hobby, and every tomato you've ever eaten exists because someone somewhere refused to accept the one that already existed. Houston here. What's the one variety in your area worth saving like that? If a tomato's history can be this unbelievable, wait until you see what happened to peppers. Potatoes, and corn, because those stories somehow get even stranger.